Well, Monday, a bunch of things happened in your little town here. It was the second term inauguration of Barack Obama. It was Martin Luther King Day. We're coming upon the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. There's really a lot to reflect on of kind of great value. And sadly, in that same kind of note, when we look around the world, what we see is just continuing conflict after continuing conflict. There's concerns about the environment, concerns about climate change, concerns whether this planet can continue to sustain 7 billion plus of us in the manner of which we're used to living. And then there's the current financial issues that have pervaded the world. So with so much to consider, our species can use all the wise leaders that it can muster. There was a Gallup poll in 1999, the end of the millennium, and people were asked, who were the most admired people in the 20th century? Who do you suppose was in the top 5? Just shout out any name you think might be in the top 5. Gandhi, FDR, Elvis, Martin Luther King, Clinton, Gene Goodall. Okay, some great names. Some of these people I think are on the list farther down. But number 1 on the list was Mother Teresa. Number 2 was Martin Luther King. 3 was JFK. Einstein was 4th. And Helen Keller was 5th. That's kind of interesting. 3 of the top 5, they're mostly known for their compassion. Now, I think if Mr. Gallup had been conducting these polls in the 5th century BCE, maybe the Buddha would have made the list. Don't know for sure. But tonight I want to reflect on the work of Martin Luther King and Siddhartha Gautama, also known as the Buddha. There's strong similarities in the teachings in both of them. So it's understood by scholars as Buddhism has migrated from northern India to other areas in Southeast Asia, into China, into Tibet, that it picked up various flavors of the times and cultures that it's landed in. And this process is certainly continuing as Buddhism comes to the West. I mean, our culture is very scientific and very psychological, so we can already begin to see how that's beginning to shape Buddhism here in our culture. But I want to reflect, I want to go back a little bit in history and reflect for a moment on how Buddhism adapted to conditions in Vietnam. Buddhism was greatly affected by the war in Vietnam that basically began with the French and then continued with the U.S. involvement. It's a little history for those who may be interested or don't know. Prior to World War II, Vietnam was a French colony. During the war, because France was occupied by Germany, they basically lost a lot of the control of a lot of their colonies. I mean, they didn't have their organizational structure. So after the war, they wanted to reestablish their empire as best they could. Well, the people in Vietnam had a different idea of how they'd like to move ahead in the future. And so from 1945 to 1954, there was a war in Vietnam. And close to 100,000 French were killed, 150,000 Vietnamese were killed. And a peace treaty was signed in 1954. And that peace treaty stipulated that and the country was divided in half. There was going to be a communist north and a quasi-free South Vietnam. But within 2 years, there was going to be elections to decide whether they were going to reunite the country or not. The United States backed the South Vietnamese government that was established there. But after 2 years, the South Vietnamese government decided, well, we don't really want to have elections. Tensions then began creeping up again. This is 1956. We started sending advisors to that government in the late 50s, and John Kennedy sent the first troops there in the early 60s. And the rest you know about. The war ended in 1975, when Vietnam was reunited. Now, the upshot of all this carnage that the people of Vietnam experienced, they experienced almost 30 years of continuous war on their soil. And that affected the practices and the philosophy of Buddhism in that culture. It was kind of interesting. There was this Vietnamese Buddhist youth organization that sprang up during the 50s and 60s. And their motto was, Bi Tri Dung, which means compassion, wisdom, and courage. And that organization continues to this day. And I'm not sure, but Thich Nhat Hanh might have been involved with that organization when he was a monk there. So in the midst of all of this, it's a little different than the way that we conceive the metaphor that we use here in the West, where we usually talk about the dove. Well, the two wings of the dove, wisdom and compassion, and it takes both wings to take flight. But due to the severe conditions in Vietnam, they added courage along with the wisdom and compassion. And when I reflect on the life of Dr. King, we could certainly say that his life expressed a very mature integration of compassion, wisdom, and courage. And if we want to consider Buddhist practices in relation to the conditions that we face today in the United States, or in the West, or in the world, I mean, here in the United States, we're entering our 10th year of war overseas. We are now threatening to attack Iran almost on a regular basis. And then we've got all our usual concerns about the environment and the economy. Excellent as they are, wisdom and compassion may not be adequate enough to meet the challenges that we're facing here. Much courage may be needed by all of us. So let's look at the work of Dr. King in relation to the Dharma. And it was a very eerily prophetic interview that he gave just before he was shot in Memphis in 1968. He was asked how he'd like to be remembered at his funeral. Actually, that's a nice exercise for all of us to do. How would you like to be remembered at your funeral? And he said this. He said, rather than his awards and where he went to school, people should talk about how he fought peacefully for justice. I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like for somebody to say that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. I want you to say that day that I tried to be right on the war question. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try to feed the hungry. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try in my life to clothe those who were naked. I want you to say on that day that I did try in my life to visit those who were in prison. And I want you to say that I tried to love and serve humanity. And yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness. And all the other shallow things will not matter. Quite a life's intention. To love, to reach out to those who are suffering, and to simply stand up for what is fair. Now, Dr. King paralleled the Buddha's teaching about love as the foundation for peace and social justice. Dr. King said this: darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate can't drive out hate. Only love can do that. And the Buddha said this: hatred can never cease by hatred. Only by love can hatred cease. And in a Gary Larson cartoon, I forgot to bring it with me, but it's in my head. It takes place in hell, okay? And there's this kind of nice matronly woman there, and she's got a platter, and on the platter there's milk and cookies. And there's a row of people sitting on a bench, and she's handing them milk and cookies. But she's interesting because she has some horns, and out of the bottom of her dress you can see the spiked tail. So these people are there. And then there's, in the other part of the cartoon, there's this door, and it's obviously Satan has come busting through the door because, you know, he's got the goatee and everything, and he's got the horns, and he's got the cloak and everything. And all these flames are coming out of this door behind him. And he's screaming, "No, no! Gosh darn it, Mom! Stop offering milk and cookies to the doomed!" You know? So there can be love everywhere. Dr. King, love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend. And those of you who've been coming here and maybe going to retreats and studied some Buddhism, you know that the Buddha taught loving kindness. That's just basically the quality of friendliness and care extended to all beings. That's friendliness and care extended to all beings, not just a selected few, without discrimination. I mean, the classic loving kindness practice generally begins with extending care to ourselves, and of course that's hard for Westerners right there, with all our self-concept and stuff that we do to ourselves, but kind of starting there, and then moving it to loved ones, and then maybe picking out people that have helped us during life, benefactors. And then it gets more and more challenging as we go to, people different than us. What about people that are difficult for us? You know, it's a lifetime of gradually expanding our capacity to love. It's a wonderful practice, and it's not so easy to extend this friendliness without discrimination. This from Mary Oliver. On cold evenings, my grandmother, with ownership of half her mind, the other half having flown back to Bohemia, spread newspapers on the porch floor So, she said, the garden ants could crawl beneath as under a blanket and keep warm. And what shall I wish for myself? But being so struck by the lightening of years, to be like her with what is left, that loving. Reminds me of something I read. Someone was talking about, I think they were talking about their parent who had Alzheimer's. But this was a very loving person who had just spent their whole life kind of giving and loving and had really cultivated it such that it was right down in the nervous system. And people would come to the door and they would have no recognition of who this person was. It's like they'd come to the door and they'd open, and the person would be standing there, and it could be, you know, one of their children or anybody. And they'd say, look, I don't know who you are, but I'm glad to see you, and you're welcome here. You know, there was something going on that had been cultivated that, at least in this case, continued to work its way through the terrible suffering of Alzheimer's. And again, from Dr. King, a slightly different angle. We must develop and maintain the capacity to forgive. He who is devoid of the power to forgive is devoid of the power to love. There is some good in the worst of us and some evil in the best of us. When we discover this, we are less prone to hate our enemies. You could say that forgiveness is one of the nuances of loving kindness practice, in a way, in that big umbrella. But it's a practice that's best approached in its own time, incrementally. I mean, can we forgive the driver who maybe cut us off today? Okay? Maybe we reflect for a moment on they must be having a really rough day and they're harried and there's chaos and maybe there's some fear. And we can kind of move to forgive them with a little work. Then the challenge comes, can we turn to those who have hurt us and betrayed us very personally in our life? Most of us have suffered in some way at the hands of others. That becomes a little more challenging to work with it. And I know a big one, I've been working on one for 23 years, actually, forgiveness. It was a time in my life where everything was kind of coming unglued and I was taken advantage of in a business transaction that cost me a pretty good stack of money, and I'd worked really hard. And 3 people kind of conspired and didn't tell the truth, and things didn't work out. So I've been working with that forgiveness for 23 years. And there are times when I think, it's like, I'm free, I'm okay. But it's a small town, Charlottesville, and these people have some power, and so their names appear in the newspaper. And then I can feel that clutch in my heart, that kind of like, like I'm still separate. I'm not completely worked through with this. And I'm sure you all have your instances, or many of you do. Maybe some of you are just totally, completely forgiving all the way down to the depths of everyone who's ever harmed you in your life. So the cultivation of a heart of forgiveness can't be forced. It's a gentle cultivation. And some of these things, it's a lifetime of reflecting on and going back to. And maybe it's more than a lifetime if you believe in that, that we go on. It's from Dr. King. he says, there's a couple of quotes here. At the center of nonviolence stands the principle of love. And he says the force for change must come from love. The force for change must come from love. And he says this, and he's kind of talking about the power of loving kindness. Now, there is a final reason, I think, that Jesus says, love your enemies. It is this, that love has within it a redemptive power, and there is a power there that eventually transforms individuals. Just keep being friendly to that person. Just keep loving them, and they can't stand it too long. Oh, they react in many ways in the beginning. They react with guilt feelings, and sometimes they'll hate you a little more at that transition period. But just keep loving them. And by the power of your love, they will break down under the load. That's love, you see. It is redemptive. And this is why Jesus says, love. There's something about love that builds up and is creative. And there is something about hate that tears down and is destructive. So love your enemies. And you can see how he manifested that in his life over and over. So Dr. King believed, just as the Buddha did, that the other side of nonviolence is love. And that love is central as the basis for any action. And it's not a weak force, it's powerful. In metta practice, in loving kindness practice, we incline the heart towards this friendliness, towards love, over and over again. It's an intention. I don't always get there, but I can often remember the intention to care, to love, to be friendly. That's the metta practice. That's the loving kindness practice. This from Albert Einstein. Remember, he was number 4 in the Gallup poll? A human being is part of a whole, called by us the universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as something separated from the rest, as a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circles of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. Widening our circles of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. And this is from Dr. King, his letter from a Birmingham jail, which he wrote in 1963. At that point, he had come out against the war. And that's early, because there wasn't much of a war movement in 1963, an anti-war movement. There was some rudiments of it, but it wasn't what it turned into. And so a lot of his clergy brethren that were involved in civil rights said, Martin, what are you doing? Don't pick up this other issue. Stay focused on civil rights here in America and let this other stuff go. And naturally, of course, not only that, but a lot of the people that were sympathetic to him on some level, when he came out against the war, he lost those people also. So he was under a lot. And so he writes part of what he wrote. It's a fabulous letter. It's lengthy. I'm just going to read a little excerpt. But if you get a chance, you might want to read it. And he says this, moreover, or he writes this, moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned with what what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. In Buddhism, the core wisdom teaching is the teachings around the roots of suffering and the roots of freedom, the Four Noble Truths. And the first of the Four Noble Truths is the truth of suffering, or stress, or unsatisfactory, in certain aspects of our life. You get born, things are going to happen. You didn't read the fine print when you were signing up to land on this planet that said, oh my gosh, you're going to get old and sick and die, and you're going to lose people, and things are going to go wrong. You didn't read that, but it was there. And the second noble truth is that, hey, there's a cause for certain aspects of this suffering. Desperately clinging to what we like, trying to hold on to something that we discover that we like, to make it stand still in the face of constant change. Nature doesn't work like that. Nature is moving all the time. This planet is based on impermanence. Nature's foundational aspect is impermanence. When we grasp onto something and try to keep it like it is, that's a losing game. It really is. I've heard it described as, trying to hold on to things. It's like getting rope burn, because everything's moving. That's on one hand. And then the things we don't like, we can exhaust ourselves by thrashing around and trying to get rid of them all the time and manipulating our environment endlessly for more and more comfort. It's exhausting. And the third noble truth is, hey, there can be an end to this suffering. That's by letting be, letting go. Releasing that clinging. And letting up on some of that thrashing around, trying to get rid of things that are unpleasant. And the fourth noble truth is, there's a path that teaches us and supports us in letting go and cultivating greater wisdom, greater understanding, a greater perspective, and cultivating a greater heart, love and compassion. And that path leads to the end of suffering, and it's called the Eightfold Path. I'm not going to go into that tonight. So this practice, it's not so much that we have difficulty, that we have physical and emotional pain, that we have loss. The practice is around, what's our reaction to these facts of life? It's the way that we struggle and have difficulty being with what's unpleasant. There's a tendency, if our hearts and minds haven't been cultivated or trained, that we're just operating on reaction. We just go off, flying off, one way or the other. But as we learn to develop, to cultivate and develop the capacity to actually be with our own difficulties, our own sufferings for a little while, a strength of heart really develops, a confidence, a capacity. Hey, I can be with this. I can do this. It's a poem by Rashani. There is a brokenness out of which comes the unbroken, a shatteredness out of which blooms the unshatterable. There is a sorrow beyond all grief, which leads to joy, and a fragility out of whose depths emerges strength. There is a hollow space, too vast for words, through which we pass with each loss, out of whose darkness we are sanctioned into being. There is a cry, deeper than all sound, whose serrated edges cut the heart, as we break open to the place inside which is unbreakable and whole while we learn to sing.